Marathon 71, y'all ready? I'm ready. All right, here we go. This story is from JB, and I got it recently, and he titled the story that Bigfoot is a nerd. And he thought this was kind of funny, but I bet he didn't think it was funny at the time. Here's what he writes. I have an interesting, maybe even a little bit funny Bigfoot story. My name is JB, and I live in the country with my 2 sons, my 3 dogs, and my wife. On this occasion, my wife was out of town for the weekend, and I wanted to treat my boys, Frankie and Cyrus, to a proper boys' night like I used to have back in the 90s with my friends when I was a kid in the city. I had ordered some DVDs of the show Dragon Ball Z in preparation of this weekend. I had ordered pizza and some soda, and I left work early to pick them up from school. It was a warm summer evening with a gentle breeze blowing in, so we opened the window in Frankie's room on the first floor of our house so that we would keep cool while watching our show. We were in Frankie's room because we had the perfect room for building a blanket fort. We stayed up late watching Dragon Ball Z until Frankie passed out in the crook of my arm, and Cyrus had gone upstairs to his room. I was propped up against Frankie's headboard, starting to drift off to sleep while the TV was playing. I noticed a faint smell like a skunk had been hit out on the road, and I opened my eyes a bit to look out the window with the thought to close it when my eyes opened all the way. In the light given off by the TV, I could have sworn that I saw a face. I thought I was dreaming as I stared, trying to figure out what in the world I was looking at. On the TV, one of the characters fired one of the attacks he was known for using, and it gave off a bright light. Right outside the window, I saw it. That window is about 6 feet off the ground, but I could clearly see this thing's face as it was watching my TV. I'm sure that I was dreaming, because there was no way something was watching TV through that window. I stared and I watched it blink, and that confirmed it for me that I was indeed awake and that I now had to protect my sons. I was thinking about what I could do to get this thing to leave. I remembered that Frankie had some toys on his nightstand, and I slowly reached for something to throw at the window. I never stopped watching it as I quietly felt for something. It seemed hypnotized by the television, and I couldn't figure out what it was outside of a big, hairy, and unpleasant-to-look-at creature. As soon as I found something solid, I gripped it and I quickly whipped it at the window opening. The toy I had hurled, it was a transformer that was found later, hit the edge of the window with a loud crack. I didn't get to see how the creature reacted because I had grabbed Frankie and ran for the open door, slamming it behind us. The dogs were awake and barking as I ran with Frankie to my room. Frankie had woken up and was asking me frantically what was going on as I grabbed my .357 revolver from its hiding spot. I told him to stay there and do not come out. I left my room and I closed the door behind me. The dogs were barking and growling at the door, and Cyrus was standing at the top of the stairs outside of his room. I told him to stay upstairs as I rushed back to Frankie's room. I yanked the door open and pointed my revolver at the window, and to my relief, whatever this was gone. My next move was to get both boys and the dogs in my room and call the police. I told the boys that something was trying to get in through the window, which is what I also told the police. Both dogs were pacing near the door, and they would bark and growl randomly at the bottom of the door. The next 20 minutes were the most tense I had experienced up until that point, and never had I been more relieved to see the red and blue light up the tree line behind my home as officers came down the driveway. I told both boys to stay in my room until it was safe. I told the 3 officers what had happened, and they spoke with my boys. The only sign that anything had happened were some muddy handprints against the wall on the outside of the house. I'm a big man, 6'4" and 200 pounds, and my hands are pretty big. And I'm not kidding when I say that those handprints were about double the size of my hands. The police wrote it off as a human intruder, and my wife thought that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But my boys and I have an idea as to what happened because both of them saw the handprints and know that I'm the kind of guy who doesn't overreact, and both of them smelled what had woken me up. But the part that gets me is that the Bigfoot apparently likes Dragon Ball Z. JB, that's an awesome story. I know that was scary for you, and that's you 6'4", 200 pounds, you're a big man. Probably handle yourself fine. But to see a face looking through the window is creepy. But what I want to commend you for is spending time with your boys, man. My boys and I used to do that. I could tell you 20 stories about things that my boys and I did when they were younger. I would go get them out of school when we were going hunting for the weekend. I'd get them out of school at like 11 and just take them hunting, and we'd go duck hunting all weekend. And we would do movie nights at home, and I just think that is so cool that you do that. I'm sorry you had to deal with what was probably a Bigfoot out your window, but it's just a cool story, and I couldn't wait to share it with the audience. So thank you for sending that in. It is pretty funny, and I really appreciate you, buddy. Thank you. Here's a story from Michael. It's not a Bigfoot story, but it's really, really interesting, and I hope you enjoy it. I think you will. The writer says, "My name is Michael, and I live in eastern Washington State. The Columbia Basin is all desert, so there are no forests that would attract a Sasquatch. But we do have a lot of farmland and large tracts of undeveloped land that is home to other wildlife. We have deer, moose, coyotes, mountain lions, and occasionally we have wolves. I'm retired now, and I don't get out as much as I would like to. Mostly when I do, I'm going for the 20-mile drive to the next town either for shopping or to see the doctor. Between my home and the next town over is a small, shallow valley that contains a creek and land that has been set aside as a wildlife sanctuary. I'll start with my first sighting in that little valley, which took place about 5 years ago. I was on my way to the doctor's appointment. I had just entered that little valley, and I glanced down to check my speedometer to make sure that I didn't gain too much speed on the downhill slope. I hadn't seen any cops on the highway that morning, but they always tend to show up whenever I exceed the speed limit. When I looked back up at the highway, I was completely dumbfounded by what I saw. It was a large black cat running at full speed crossing the highway. And when I say huge, that is an understatement. From its nose to the tip of its tail, its length was nearly the same as the width of the two-lane highway. There was a wire fence along each side of the highway, and this cat leapt over it without breaking its stride. On the other side of the fence is a large patch of sagebrush that extends for several acres. I've spent many days walking through that sagebrush looking for arrowheads and other artifacts in the past, so I'm familiar with the height of those bushes. The sagebrush is between 3 and 4 feet high. And when that cat continued running through the sagebrush, I could see its back over the bushes, clearing it by nearly 2 feet. Like I said, that cat was huge. I have seen several mountain lions around here, and they are dwarfed in comparison. The next unusual thing I saw was in that same little valley, but this time I got a good long look at the animal. I had driven down into the valley and looked off to the side of the road on the other side of that fence. That was when I saw the biggest wolf I have ever seen in my life. And again, I could use the average height of the sagebrush to determine the size of the animal. I have seen some large wolves before, but this one was between 4.5 and 5 feet tall at the shoulders. The only thing I can compare it to would be to a dire wolf, but those have been extinct for thousands of years. It just stood there in a large clearing away from the sagebrush, so I did get a nice long look at it. The most irritating thing about it was that I never thought to stop and take a picture. I guess that is the biggest downside of being old. With all the modern technology we have, I tend to forget that the phone in my pocket also has a camera. But even though I didn't get a picture of it, the sighting of this wolf did get some verification a couple of days later. My wife at the time was driving on one of the many back roads late at night when something ran in front of her car. She hit the brakes to avoid hitting it, and it stood in the middle of the road looking at her. When it walked up to the car and began sniffing, it walked around the car trying to see in. Its head and back were higher than the hood of the car. I guess she was in shock from seeing something that large approach her car, and she just sat there while it walked around the car. But when it got to the driver's side and was looking in with great interest, she finally took off and got home as quickly as she could. Michael, that's pretty awesome, man. I've read up on the dire wolves and a lot of the pre- and post-Pleistocene animals, the dire wolves, the short-faced bear, there's just hundreds of creatures that have gone extinct that, oh man, wouldn't it be cool to see one today? And maybe some of those big wolves survived and they're just not seen very much. I don't know. Probably not. It may have just been a giant wolf, just a really super big wolf. But either way, those are great stories. And the cat, oh man, I hear stories about these black cats all over the place, but I never hear about them being that big. Anyway, it's a great submission and a great email, and I appreciate the way you described everything. So thank you very much, Michael, for sending that in. Before I get into this story, this is a post-edit note. I've come back in to record this to let you know that this story you're about to hear is an exceptional story. It's scary, it's spooky. But here's the deal. A lot of times when I get in these emails, I don't know if it's a man or a woman who is writing me. And this email was very vague. And on the front end of the story, you're going to hear me refer to this person as a man. I made an assumption based on some combat situations that this person talks about while they're in the service. However, you'll notice towards the end of the video that she'll say that she was a really scared lady. And I didn't discover this until I actually read through the story. I'm trying to get out of here and go catch me some redfishes and some trouts. I'm going to have about 4 days off, and I'm not going back to re-record this because the story is the same. So I wanted to say that before we got started on this video. And I don't mean to offend anyone. The writer is, it's just an honest mistake. But let's get on with the story, all right? Here we go. Here's a good story. The writer wants to keep his name out of it and be anonymous, which is perfectly fine, as always. He writes, I'm not one to write very much, but I figured after stumbling onto your channel and listening to a few episodes and saw just how open you are to reading and enjoying the story folks tell, that I would share a rather frightening encounter that I had 10 years ago. And there's a long paragraph here about his background in the military. The man was I'm not going to read it, but the man is an Army veteran. He's a combat veteran, although he says he wasn't in any really high-speed death machine type incidents. I just want to tell him, any kind of conflict that you're in is going to cause you... what I mean to say is my son was in the Marine Corps, and he fought in Afghanistan, and I know he was for lack of a better term, he was in the crap. And they were out for days and days and weeks at a time, and they never went to a FOB, and they were, it's just the outfit he was in. Anyway, all that to say, I want you to know I understand your training and your experiences, but let's get on to your story. And thank you for what you did. He writes, my hometown was in the Pacific Northwest for many years of my life, and home to many legends, as you well and truly know by now. I've always been open-minded towards things I don't fully understand, as history demonstrates a notion of there's got to be something that these folks are seeing. This is especially true regarding cryptids like Bigfoot, at least for me. Anyway, I was asked by a close friend of mine at the time to go berry picking, as a plethora of types were apparently in season. Considering she was pretty awesome to me and it got me away from my college studies for a bit, I figured why not? It was somewhere around late summer or early fall when we went up into the northern Idaho area to pick these berries. She said that she knew the area well and she was trying to scare me by saying that it was bear and cougar country. I laughed it off and I said, that's no big deal. Put a single action .44 Magnum in a leather holster around my waist. I smiled and said, let's do it. Let's go for it. Naturally, we transported the firearm safely because that is a no-brainer. After about 2.5 hours drive up about a dozen back roads and eventually logging roads, we finally arrived. She and I got out of the truck. It was a 2013 Silverado and headed out about 50 yards or so to start picking. The truck is an important note for context because it wasn't a jacked up pickup or even running a leveling kit. Straight, not fancy, stock truck. She was laughing and telling me about some of her friends being typical blondes and a sense of extreme danger washed over me. My Army training kicked into overdrive, spidey senses in full gear, and I instinctively started looking around and I began assessing what was going on. I repeatedly asked myself, what is up? Why do you feel this way? What do you think? It's a tactical assessment of an unknown situation, really, and if anything the Army taught me, your gut instincts are rarely a lie. As this was happening to me, I noticed the reasoning for my senses getting spun up. There was a silence around us that I've only experienced a handful of times, mostly while deployed and before bad juju was to start up. No birds were chirping, though I could see them, and no wind was blowing, and no bugs, no wildlife of any kind, just nothing. Total stillness that even now I get the chills thinking about. My mindset shifted to something is now way off, and that's when I heard it. With the roar of which I've never heard before a day in my life, and the punch to my chest like sitting watching the National Hot Rod Association funny cars, attempted escape velocity in 1/4 mile, that roar hit me square in the chest. Whatever it was that made this sound was moving our way. You just couldn't miss it from the crashing branches and the stomps and additional screams that this thing made. I could tell that my friend knew something was terribly wrong and she moved behind me. Still approximately 50 yards away from the truck, the inability to run, and with this freight train running down on us, we finally saw it. My best guess was it was about 15 yards away when it broke the concealment of the wood line, and it wasn't exactly pleased to see us. It paused, never once lowering its gaze to my eyes. It puffed its chest way out, and it screamed again. Massive isn't an appropriate word for this brick of a creature. It easily stood 8 to 9 feet plus by my best guess based on distance, and it probably weighed over 500 pounds. And long, matted, coal-black hair covered the creature. Typical features you read and talk about: sunken human eyes, hands, feet, teeth, high eyebrows, defined muscles, the list goes on. The only thing I didn't notice was if there was a smell or not. It was for sure a male, and again, none too pleased that we were there. My instinct screamed out that this thing was going to charge us. The distance was too close for more than one shot. That .44 has a kick. All these thoughts started going through my head at the same time. My dominant hand was still around my belt but hovering over the handle of the pistol, ready to draw, but I knew I didn't want to provoke this animal. Some of the books that I've read said that this is a display of dominance in apes. It's a scare tactic, and I can assure you the scare portion was quite effective. We wouldn't have had a chance against it if it had charged anyway, so the one shot would have to count. This brick of a creature snorted over and over again, breathing like a Mack truck, baring its teeth and peeling its lips back. Each time it bared its teeth at us, it would raise its arms over its head and keep them there for a moment and lower them after a few seconds. It repeated this over and over again several times until it decided to move in on us. Again, at about 15 yards away, this thing took a step forward and then another, and that's when the pistol came out. Being a single action revolver, I had to cock the hammer in order to be ready to fire. But when the pistol came out and I cocked that hammer, silently praying to whomever was listening, what the creature did next actually surprised me. It pumped the brakes and came to a dead stop. The muzzle was pointed directly at the creature's chest. I would guess that it was about 10 yards away when it stopped. We were staring each other down with an intensity I've never felt before. Looking at me in its bared teeth once more, it snorted, turned to my left, and then it walked off. Passing my truck, head and shoulders easily past the roof, it was gone in what seemed to be about 10 or so steps. No more screams, no breaking branches, no nothing. Just me, one really shook-up lady, a .44 Magnum shaking in my hand, no berries, and an encounter that could have gone slightly better. I really considered pressing that trigger to the rear, but again, based on what I could see, I had my doubts that a .44 Magnum with hydro shocks loaded into the cylinder would have made a significant impact on this animal. My confidence against other targets with that round was great, as it is a very effective round overall, but against that thing, I'd have some hesitation. After we got back into the truck and returned to her folks' place where she lived at the time, she ran into her house crying uncontrollably. Her mom greeted her and returned inside holding her daughter, looking at me like a concerned parent would. Her stepdad, a friend of mine and retired Army first sergeant, looked at her and then me, walked to me and asked what happened. I just sat down on the tailgate of my truck and I said to him, "You wouldn't believe it even if you were there with us." After further prying, I told him what had happened. He looked at me like a first sergeant would a fresh private saying something quite dumb. Yet he saw the conviction in my eyes and asked if I was all right. I said I was, but I could use a rather stiff drink. He returned to the house and validated my side of the story with his stepdaughter. Upon his return outside, he asked me again if I was all right, and I repeated the same mantra at this point. He thanked me for getting her home safe and said he'd better get back inside. I nodded, apologized for causing a rather unpleasant and rather unbelievable evening for them. He chuckled a bit and said, "You know, it could have been a lot worse." That's my story of a rather frightening encounter with something that was not too thrilled that we were there. Whether or not the listeners believe it or not, I'm afraid you won't change my mind on what I saw that day. If anything that would conceivably haunt me is the fact it stopped when the hammer was cocked. That is something, along with our eyes locking, staring each other down like a set of hungry wolves, that I will never forget. Again, I appreciate the way you run your channel, and I hope you will continue to do it the same way. Feel free to share it also for your channel, and I look forward to hearing you narrate it if you choose to share it. Wow, what a great story. What a scary story. And that is so crazy that you had that pistol, excuse me for all you gun nuts, revolver, pointed straight at this thing's chest, and it didn't stop until you pulled that hammer back. It must have heard that click. It must have seen you do it, which tells me this thing knew what that gun was and knew what that gun would do. That's amazing. That's a great story. You wrote it really well. You got your point across, and I loved it, and I know everyone else did too. Thank you so much for sending the story. That's going to do it for this video. Thank you once again. I know I say this every time, but I really mean it. Thank you for listening this far. It means the world to my channel. I understand that I have to produce good content, good, interesting content to keep you interested and hold your interest to listen this far. And if I did that, I feel like I've done my job. I love doing this channel. I love that you listened, and I appreciate you so much. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks.